Lieutenant Sarah Chen pressed her back against the cold concrete wall of the bombed-out building, trying to steady her breathing. The sharp pain shooting up her left leg reminded her of the shrapnel that had torn through her thigh during the ambush 3 hours ago. Blood had soaked through the makeshift bandage she'd fashioned from her torn uniform sleeve, and each heartbeat sent fresh waves of agony through her body. The mission had seemed straightforward when her squad received the orders that morning. Intelligence suggested a small enemy outpost was operating from an abandoned factory on the outskirts of the war-torn city. Their job was simple reconnaissance: gather information about enemy movements and report back to headquarters, nothing they hadn't done dozens of times before. Sarah had been leading her 5-person team through the narrow alleyways when the world exploded around them. The enemy had been waiting, hidden in strategic positions throughout the district. What should have been a routine surveillance mission became a deadly trap. The first explosion had come from their left flank, followed immediately by automatic gunfire from 3 different directions. In the chaos that followed, Sarah watched her team scatter for cover. Private Martinez dove behind an overturned car, while Sergeant Williams pulled 2 other soldiers into a doorway across the street. The deafening sound of bullets ricocheting off metal and concrete filled the air, punctuated by shouted orders in a language Sarah couldn't understand. She had been moving to regroup with Williams when the second explosion knocked her off her feet. The blast wave threw her against a concrete barrier, and she felt something hot and sharp tear through her leg. When she looked down, she saw the jagged piece of metal protruding from her thigh, and the growing pool of blood beneath her. Through the smoke and confusion, she heard Williams shouting orders to fall back. The enemy fire was too intense, too coordinated. They were outnumbered and outgunned. Sarah tried to call out, to let them know her position, but her voice was lost in the thunder of combat. She watched helplessly as her team retreated down a side street, forced to abandon their position under heavy fire. The shooting continued for another 10 minutes before an eerie silence fell over the area. Sarah remained motionless behind the concrete barrier, afraid that any movement would give away her position. She could hear enemy soldiers moving through the area, their voices growing closer as they searched for survivors. With tremendous effort, she managed to drag herself into the ruins of a nearby building. The structure had taken a direct hit during an earlier bombing, leaving only partial walls and piles of rubble. It wasn't much cover, but it was better than lying exposed in the street. She found a corner where fallen beams created a small shelter and pulled herself inside. As the adrenaline began to fade, the full extent of her injuries became clear. Besides the shrapnel wound in her leg, she had cuts and bruises covering her arms and torso. Her radio had been damaged in the blast, its screen cracked and circuits exposed. When she tried to power it on, nothing happened. Her primary weapon was missing, lost somewhere in the explosion, leaving her with only a sidearm and 2 spare magazines. Hours passed as Sarah listened to the sounds of enemy patrols moving through the area. She counted at least 3 different groups, each conducting systematic searches of the buildings around her hiding spot. Twice, soldiers came close enough that she could hear their individual footsteps, but somehow they missed the small gap where she had taken shelter. As evening approached, the temperature began to drop. Sarah realized she was facing a terrible choice. Her leg wound needed proper medical attention, and she was losing blood steadily. Without her radio, she had no way to contact headquarters or call for extraction. The enemy controlled this entire sector of the city, making any attempt to move extremely dangerous. She thought about her team and wondered if they had made it back safely. Williams was an experienced sergeant who knew how to handle difficult situations. He would have reported her as missing in action, but would anyone come looking for her behind enemy lines? Military protocol in hostile territory was clear. The mission and the safety of the unit came first. Individual soldiers who became separated were expected to evade and survive until they could rejoin friendly forces. But Sarah was in no condition to evade anything. Every movement sent fire through her injured leg, and she was growing weaker by the hour. She had 1 bottle of water and a few energy bars in her pack, enough food for maybe 2 days if she rationed carefully. After that, she would be completely dependent on finding other sources of sustenance in enemy territory. As darkness settled over the ruined city, Sarah tried to assess her options realistically. She was wounded, alone, and trapped behind enemy lines with no communication equipment. Her team thought she was dead or captured. The nearest friendly forces were at least 15 miles away, across territory crawling with enemy patrols. The smart thing to do would be to try moving at night when visibility was limited. But in her condition, she doubted she could travel more than a few hundred yards without collapsing. The wound in her leg was still bleeding, and she was beginning to feel lightheaded from blood loss. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to remember her survival training. The instructors had drilled into them the importance of maintaining hope and focusing on immediate, achievable goals. Right now, her goal was simple: survive the night and reassess her situation in the morning. Everything else could wait. She tore strips from her undershirt to create fresh bandages for her leg wound. The bleeding had slowed somewhat, but the injury needed proper cleaning and stitches. She used half of her water to rinse the wound as best she could, knowing that infection could kill her just as surely as enemy bullets. Through the gaps in the rubble, she could see lights moving in the distance as enemy patrols continued their searches. Radio chatter echoed off the buildings, though she couldn't understand what they were saying. The fact that they were still actively looking for survivors suggested they knew at least one member of her team was unaccounted for. Around midnight, the patrol activity seemed to decrease. Sarah allowed herself to hope that perhaps the enemy would assume any survivors had already escaped the area, but she knew better than to count on that assumption. They would likely maintain a presence in this sector for days, making her escape even more challenging. She ate one of her energy bars slowly, trying to make it last as long as possible. The sweet taste reminded her of home and better times, but she pushed those thoughts away. Nostalgia was a luxury she couldn't afford right now. She needed to stay focused on survival. As she settled into her hiding place for what she hoped wouldn't be her final night, Sarah made herself a promise. If she survived until morning, she would find a way to signal for help. Somewhere out there, friendly forces might be looking for her. Her job was to stay alive long enough for them to find her, no matter how impossible that seemed right now. The second day began with the sound of helicopter rotors in the distance. Sarah woke from a fitful sleep, her body stiff and cold from spending the night on concrete rubble. The wound in her leg had stopped bleeding, but the surrounding area was swollen and hot to the touch. She knew infection was setting in, and without antibiotics, her condition would only get worse. She carefully moved to a gap in the debris where she could observe the street outside. Enemy soldiers were still patrolling the area, though less frequently than the day before. They seemed more relaxed now, probably assuming that any survivors had either been captured or had fled during the night. This might be her opportunity to try something different. Sarah remembered the emergency beacon in her survival kit. It was designed for search and rescue operations, broadcasting a coded signal that friendly aircraft could detect. The device was small enough to hide easily, but using it was extremely risky. If enemy forces had the right equipment, they might be able to triangulate her position from the signal. She spent the morning weighing her options. Her food was running low. She had developed a fever from the infected wound, and she was growing weaker by the hour. Staying hidden might keep her safe temporarily, but it was essentially a slow death sentence. Using the beacon was dangerous, but it was her only real chance of getting rescued. Around noon, she heard something that made her heart race with hope. In the distance, barely audible over the ambient noise of the city, she caught the sound of aircraft engines. Not helicopters this time, but fixed-wing aircraft flying at high altitude. It could be friendly reconnaissance planes conducting surveillance of the area. Sarah made her decision. She activated the emergency beacon and placed it in a location where its signal would have the best chance of reaching aircraft overhead. The device would broadcast for exactly 90 seconds before automatically shutting down to preserve battery life and avoid detection. Those 90 seconds might be her only chance. She waited anxiously as the beacon transmitted its distress signal into the sky. The coded message included her identification number and confirmed she was alive and in need of extraction. Now she had to hope someone was listening and that they cared enough about one missing soldier to risk a rescue operation. Hours passed with no obvious response to her signal. Sarah began to wonder if she had made a terrible mistake. Enemy patrols seemed more active in the late afternoon, and she worried they might have detected her transmission. She moved deeper into her hiding place and tried to stay as quiet as possible. As evening approached, she noticed something different about the enemy patrol patterns. Instead of random searches, they seemed to be moving with more purpose, checking specific locations in a systematic grid pattern. Her worst fears were confirmed when she overheard radio chatter that sounded more urgent than before. They had detected something, possibly her beacon signal, and were trying to locate its source. Sarah realized she was running out of time. If the enemy found her hiding spot, her chances of survival would drop to zero. She had heard enough stories about what happened to captured soldiers in this war to know that surrender wasn't really an option. She would have to try moving, despite her injured leg and weakened condition. She waited until full darkness before attempting to leave her shelter. Moving was agony, each step sending bolts of pain through her injured leg, but she forced herself to keep going. Her plan was to reach a different building several blocks away, hopefully throwing off the search pattern before they found her current location. Progress was painfully slow. What should have been a 5-minute walk took her over an hour, and she had to stop frequently to rest and listen for patrols. Twice she had to hide in doorways as enemy soldiers passed nearby, their flashlights sweeping the streets methodically. She finally reached an abandoned apartment building that offered better concealment than her previous hiding spot. The structure was more intact, with multiple rooms and escape routes if she was discovered. She found a spot on the second floor where she could observe the street while remaining hidden from view. From her new position, she could see the enemy search teams working their way through the area where she had been hiding. They were using handheld devices that looked like signal detectors, confirming her suspicion that they had picked up her beacon transmission. She had escaped just in time. The third day brought new challenges. Sarah's fever had worsened overnight, and she was having difficulty staying alert for long periods. Her water was almost gone, and she hadn't eaten anything in over 24 hours. She knew she was reaching the limits of what her body could endure. During a brief moment of clearer thinking, she decided to try the beacon one more time. If friendly forces were looking for her, they might have moved search aircraft into the area by now. It was a desperate gamble, but she was running out of alternatives. This time, she chose a different location for the transmission, moving to the building's roof where the signal would have better range. She activated the beacon and then immediately moved back downstairs, not wanting to be anywhere near the device when enemy direction-finding equipment started looking for it. The response came faster than she had expected, but not in the way she had hoped. Within an hour of the transmission, she heard vehicles converging on her area. Enemy forces were definitely tracking her signals now, and they were getting better at triangulating her position. Sarah realized she was trapped. The enemy had surrounded the building, and she could hear soldiers moving through the lower floors. They were conducting a room-by-room search, and it was only a matter of time before they reached her location. She prepared herself mentally for what might be her final stand. But then she heard something else, something that made her heart jump with hope. In the distance, barely audible over the sound of enemy activity below, she caught the distinctive whine of jet engines flying low and fast. Military aircraft were approaching the area, and they were moving with the kind of speed and purpose that suggested a combat mission. The enemy soldiers in the building seemed to hear it too. Their methodical search suddenly became more urgent, with shouted orders echoing through the structure. They knew that friendly forces were close, and they wanted to complete their mission before any rescue attempt could begin. Sarah moved to a window where she could observe the sky. Through the darkness, she could make out the running lights of multiple aircraft circling the area. They were definitely military, but whether they were friendly or enemy reinforcements remained to be seen. Her question was answered moments later when the first missile struck an enemy position 3 blocks away. The explosion lit up the night sky and was immediately followed by several more impacts. Friendly aircraft were conducting precision strikes against enemy positions throughout the sector. The soldiers searching Sarah's building suddenly had bigger problems than finding one wounded enemy soldier. Radio chatter became frantic as commanders tried to coordinate their response to the airstrikes. She could hear vehicles starting up and moving rapidly away from the building as enemy forces tried to disperse and avoid the aerial bombardment. For the first time in 3 days, Sarah allowed herself to believe she might actually survive this ordeal. The airstrike suggested that someone had received her distress signals and was mounting a rescue operation. She just had to stay alive long enough for ground forces to reach her position. She used the chaos of the airstrikes to move to a better defensive position within the building. If rescue forces were coming, she wanted to be somewhere they could find her easily, but she also needed to be prepared in case enemy soldiers returned to continue their search. As the bombardment continued around her, Sarah clutched her sidearm and waited for whatever would happen next. The next few hours would determine whether her desperate gamble to signal for help would result in rescue or capture. The airstrikes had been going on for 2 hours when Sarah heard a different sound cutting through the night. It was the distinctive whop 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 of helicopter rotors, but these were flying much lower than the jets that had been conducting the bombing runs. She moved carefully to a window that faced the street and peered out into the darkness. 3 military helicopters were approaching her position, flying in a tight formation just above the rooftops. Even in the dim light, she could make out the familiar markings of her own country's air force. These weren't enemy aircraft. They were coming for her. The lead helicopter circled the building once before hovering directly overhead. Sarah could see soldiers rappelling down ropes onto the roof above her. Within minutes, she heard boots moving across the ceiling and down the stairwells of the building. Someone was calling out in English, asking for any friendly forces to identify themselves. Sarah tried to shout back, but her voice came out as barely more than a whisper. The fever and dehydration had taken their toll, and she could barely speak above a croak. She grabbed her sidearm and fired 2 shots into the ceiling, the universal signal for friendly forces in distress. The response was immediate. Heavy footsteps thundered down the hallway toward her position, and she heard voices coordinating their approach. A moment later, a soldier in full combat gear appeared in her doorway, weapon raised and ready. When he saw her condition, his posture relaxed slightly. "Lieutenant Chen?" he asked, though it was obvious from her uniform and dog tags that he had found the right person. "We're here to get you out." The soldier spoke into his radio, confirming they had located the missing officer and needed immediate medical evacuation. Within seconds, 2 more soldiers entered the room. One of them, a medic who immediately began assessing Sarah's injuries. "How long have you been here?" the medic asked as he examined the infected wound on her leg. Sarah tried to answer but found herself struggling to form coherent words. The relief of finally being found, combined with her physical condition, was overwhelming her ability to communicate. 3 days. She finally managed to whisper. "Been hiding. Injured in the ambush." The medic nodded grimly as he looked at her leg wound. The infection had spread significantly, and her fever indicated her body was struggling to fight it off. "We need to get her to a field hospital immediately," he told the team leader. "This infection could go septic if we don't get antibiotics into her soon." While the medic worked to stabilize Sarah's condition, the other soldiers secured the building and established a perimeter. She learned that her rescue was the result of an incredibly complex operation that had taken days to plan and execute. After her team had returned and reported her missing, military intelligence had spent hours analyzing enemy communications and movement patterns. When her first beacon signal was detected, it had triggered a massive surveillance effort to pinpoint her location and assess the feasibility of a rescue mission. The challenge had been enormous. The enemy controlled this entire sector of the city, and they had been actively hunting for her since detecting her distress signals. A conventional rescue mission would have required a major military operation that could have resulted in significant casualties. Instead, military planners had decided on a more subtle approach. The airstrikes that had preceded her rescue weren't random bombardments. They were carefully targeted attacks designed to disrupt enemy communications and force them to abandon their search for her. While enemy forces were dealing with the aerial bombardment, a small special operations team had been inserted to extract her. The soldiers who had found her belonged to an elite reconnaissance unit that specialized in deep penetration missions behind enemy lines. They had been tracking her beacon signals for the past day, waiting for the right moment to attempt a rescue. The airstrikes had provided the perfect cover for their insertion. "Your beacon saved your life," the team leader explained, as they prepared to move her to the extraction point. "Without those signals, we never would have been able to pinpoint your location in time." The medic had managed to clean and rebandage her leg wound, and had started an IV to combat her dehydration. Sarah was feeling more alert, though she was still very weak. The antibiotics he had given her would need time to work against the infection. Moving her to the extraction point required careful coordination. The building was clear, but enemy forces were still active in the surrounding area. The airstrikes had scattered them temporarily, but they would be regrouping and trying to figure out what had happened. 2 soldiers supported Sarah as they made their way to the roof. Her injured leg could barely support any weight, but with their help she was able to climb the stairs slowly. The effort left her exhausted, but she was determined not to slow down the rescue operation any more than necessary. On the roof, one of the helicopters was waiting with its engines running. The aircraft was a specialized medical evacuation variant, equipped with advanced life support equipment and staffed with a flight surgeon. Sarah was loaded onto a stretcher and secured inside the aircraft within minutes of reaching the rooftop. As the helicopter lifted off and banked away from the building, Sarah caught a glimpse of the city below through the aircraft's window. She could see fires burning where the airstrikes had hit enemy positions, and searchlights sweeping the streets as enemy forces continued their futile hunt for her. The flight to the field hospital took only 20 minutes, but it felt like hours to Sarah. The flight surgeon worked constantly during the journey, monitoring her vital signs and adjusting her IV medications. She drifted in and out of consciousness, her body finally allowing itself to shut down now that she was safe. She woke up in a clean hospital bed, her leg properly bandaged and her body connected to various monitoring devices. A nurse explained that she had been unconscious for almost 18 hours while doctors worked to treat her infection and stabilize her condition. The surgery on her leg had gone well, and while she would need several weeks of recovery time, there shouldn't be any permanent damage. Later that day, her commanding officer visited to debrief her on the mission and her subsequent ordeal. He explained that her team had made it back safely, though they had been devastated by the assumption that she had been killed in the ambush. Sergeant Williams had blamed himself for leaving her behind, even though military protocol had required him to evacuate his surviving soldiers. The intelligence gathered from her rescue mission had proven valuable in planning future operations in that sector. The enemy's response to her distress signals had revealed several previously unknown communication networks and weapon positions. In a strange way, her ordeal had contributed to the broader military effort. Most importantly, her survival had demonstrated the effectiveness of the military's commitment to leave no soldier behind. Despite the risks and complexity involved, the chain of command had authorized a dangerous rescue mission to save one missing soldier. That commitment meant everything to the troops who put their lives on the line every day. As Sarah began the slow process of physical recovery, she reflected on the events that had nearly cost her life. The ambush had been a devastating setback, but her survival had depended on training, determination, and the courage of soldiers who risked their own lives to bring her home. She had spent 3 days convinced that she had been abandoned behind enemy lines, but the truth was quite different. From the moment her team had reported her missing, dozens of people had been working around the clock to find her and bring her home. The beacon signals that had seemed so desperate and hopeless had actually been the key to her salvation. Within a month, Sarah had recovered enough to return to light duty. Her leg would always bear the scars of that terrible night, but her spirit had been strengthened by the experience. She had learned that no matter how dark the situation might seem, hope was never truly lost as long as there were people willing to risk everything to help those in need.